So we've already decided that we don't want to practice evangelism in the old models of Christian malpractice and spiritual violence. We are not here to tell other people that we're right and they're wrong and they'd better shape up if they don't want to go to hell. Journeying together through discovering the good news of Jesus Christ is our new working definition of evangelism. Really a different approach. But how do we do that? By practicing spiritual intimacy. So what's that? Spiritual intimacy is journeying together through the deep places of our life and experience, and talking together about how our spirit and God's spirit interact in those deep places. Talking about those deep places together is not the strong suit of many Episcopalians. How many conversations about sports or the weather have you had at coffee hour at church? It's so easy to stay on the surface with polite small talk. When someone asks you, "How are you?" we all know there are two correct answers: fine or busy. But if we are not talking about what Jesus is doing in our lives, we are not a church, we are a club. Spiritual intimacy is a much more demanding but rewarding pursuit. It requires vulnerability, trust, openness, risk-taking, and patience. It cannot be rushed. That's a demanding set of attributes. It's hard for people, especially in a culture like the Episcopal Church that values politeness and looking like we have our lives all together, to risk vulnerability and trust inside our congregations, much less outside in the world. So how do we do that? This is how evangelism ties into all the rest of our spiritual disciplines. They feed each other. In order to have the courage to be spiritually intimate with others, we have to be spiritually intimate with God. And that means spiritual practice. That means reading and studying Scripture and the spiritual greats throughout church history. It means regular participation in worship, fellowship, service to others, justice and peace work, and most of all, a deep and abiding prayer life. We have no story to share if we have no story to share. Evangelism is not about communicating doctrine. It's about receiving and sharing stories of God's work in our lives. So just as evangelism is a key part of our discipleship, the rest of our discipleship feeds into our ability to be evangelists, spiritual companions to others. We have to be willing to go with people into their pain and their joy and invite them into our pain and our joy. So how do we get started? The primary methodology of evangelism should always be asking questions. What matters most to the other person? What do they value? What has helped them through tough times? We want to ask open-ended questions here, questions that don't have yes or no answers, questions that invite someone to share their story. Previous evangelism modalities have often started with the ludicrous assumption of a blank slate, as though the person had no spiritual journey prior to meeting us. Of course, that's ridiculous. The opposite is almost always true. There are rich and interesting stories that others can share of the ups and downs of their soul over time. And that's one of the opportunities we have to be evangelized. We listen and receive and are blessed by the walk of others and what they've learned along the way. So, if you want to open a spiritual conversation and you don't know where to start, ask the other person this: what's been on your mind lately? And if the person shares something deeper than small talk, you now have an opportunity to respond with love, with support, possibly with an echo of something similar having happened in your life and how you felt about God during that time. If someone shares news of a diagnosis, you say, "When my mom had cancer, I was really angry at God." Or they share a joy and you say, "When my first grandchild was born, I felt so blessed, so thankful to God." Spiritual intimacy starts with taking a risk and giving an invitation that is that simple. But the result can be life-changing, not just for your conversation partner, but for you as well. I'm Whitney Rice, the Canon for Evangelism and Discipleship Development in the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri. And thank you for joining us for Evangelism with Integrity.